Hello, everyone. Lovely to see myself, not see you, but for you to see me. If you would do me a favor and check in by typing your name in the live chat so I can make sure I mark complete everybody who is watching this, because this is required, like I said. First, before I get into review stuff, if you weren't paying attention to the news or anything, the governor, we know, extended the stay-at-home order through May the 8th. But sorry if you can hear like music in the background. It's like a clock that goes off every hour. But he extended it to the May the 8th. That doesn't apply to schools, but we know that our schools were already close to the 15th. And later this afternoon at some time, the governor's supposed to make an announcement on what's going to happen after May 18th. So tentatively right now we're going back to school on Monday the 18th, but I don't see that happening. And I assume that, and that's what everybody's saying. They just assume that that's what he will be saying this afternoon. But when he makes it official, I'll be sure to send it in the remind so that you guys know. If by some, odd change of events, we do go back to school on May 18th, then we would only have school for like a week, because I believe our tech is like May 21st. So it would really not even be a full week. It would just be like 4 days. So I don't really see that happening. So anyway, if I hope everybody's doing well. As always, of course, let me know if you guys have been pretty good about texting me if you're struggling with your assignments or if you need clarification on something in the notes. I know you're doing your project yesterday and the day before. I hope you enjoyed that. Usually it's like one of the top things people really like to do is this project, but normally it looks a lot different because we're doing it in class and we're doing it in groups, and you don't do like a presentation type of deal. It's definitely a lot more fun when we do it in class, but I hope you at least enjoyed it a little bit and learned some stuff about your topic. The 80s are pretty cool. That being said, don't forget that it is due tonight. I think I have it set for 11:59. So as long as you've got it uploaded and everything, then you're good to go. If something happens and you don't feel like it's uploading properly, definitely just email it to me when in doubt if you're struggling with that, with getting it to upload. But if you are having problems with your project in general, if you need clarification on something, just let me know. Several people have reached out. But I think for the most part, this is pretty straightforward and you might not need a lot of help. But that being said, since it's due tonight, do not wait till 11:30 to ask me for help, because I'm going to be asleep and I'm not going to help you and you're just going to be in trouble. So, if you're working on your project today, take a pause for this review, but then get back to it and remember to get that done, because you can always study over the weekend before your test on Monday. So a couple of things about your test. I'm going to actually take one of those. I'm actually going to, in this video, tell you what short answers you're going to do. I decided instead of the third question, I usually do, because we do that like group project for the 80s, and you not only get to see like your category if it's movies, you also get to see all the other ones. So there's plenty to write about. But we weren't really able to do that. So I'm just going to take off that third question that I put on the short answer that you see on your study guide. So we're just going to do both the first two. So I'm telling you right now, you have to answer both of the short answer questions. Here I am telling you what you can write. All you need to do is pick which topics you want, dive in deeper, and write them in paragraph form. So I'm really setting it up for you. If you don't do it properly, that is 100% on you. And now that we're on this like complete or incomplete thing, if you don't do it properly, I'm not going to say it's like, bad. I can't give you a bad grade. I'm going to make you redo it. So don't give yourself more work later. Just do it right the first time, since I'm giving you all of the info you need to know. I am going to save this live, so you can definitely go back and watch it this weekend, if like later this afternoon or sometime tomorrow you want to like write out your your responses ahead of time. Honestly, that's what I would do. And then you can just pop them in the test, when it comes. Also, I had a meeting this morning that ran longer than I thought it was going to be. So I'm not quite done with your Kahoot. I am working on it though. So I'll put that up. It will go up right after this live is over. I'll put it up, in maybe an hour or two, but I'll send out a remind when it's up, and I'll keep it up for 24 hours. So you can play the Kahoot as many times as you want. So honestly, everybody should make 100 on this test. There's really no reason to make less than an A. If you do the Kahoot a bunch of times, you'll remember the answers. If you prepare for the short answer ahead of time, you'll know exactly what you need to write, and you'll get all 10 points. So this should be pretty straightforward. So I'll start with the short answer, and I'll talk about both of those, and then I'll do the matching. So if you have questions about the short answer as I'm going through them, just type them in the live. Don't forget there's a delay, so it might take me a minute to see your question, but I will, do my best to get to it. Let me look at the actual questions. Okay, so the first question is the 1970s and 80s experienced a great deal of chaos and political upheaval. Identify and explain 3 political events, and be sure to explain their impact on the presidency. So even though we talked about 4 administrations in this unit, this was a really quick unit, just Nixon to Reagan, short and sweet, but just, 20 years worth of time. But even though we talked about 4 presidencies, Ford, what is there really to talk about? He was only president for 2 years, so you really don't need to worry about trying to cover Ford in this. Really, the 3 presidencies that you can point to specific events of chaos and political upheaval are Nixon, Carter, and Reagan. So for Nixon, the obvious choice there is Watergate. And I feel like since you watched the whole video on Watergate, you did your reflection on Watergate, and we talked plenty about it. That's probably one that a lot of people will choose. It's, as long as you can understand how to explain it. Definitely a common mistake I see when people try to explain Watergate is saying that Nixon orchestrated the break-in. We don't know that. All we know is that Nixon was involved in the cover-up. So make sure that you don't get those things mixed up whenever you're writing out your answer. But if you pick Watergate, make sure you can explain what happened. So what the crime was, where they broke into, and then explain how it traced to the president, and then what the impact of it was. Obviously being it, began an impeachment inquiry. They were ready to impeach the president, and then he resigned. So make sure that you can explain all of those and how it, reflected on not just Nixon, but the office of the presidency in general, damaging people's trust in the government, all that stuff. As for Carter, there are 4 things that you could talk about in terms of political upheaval for Carter. We know that his administration was a roller coaster. Sorry. Are you having notes flashbacks to all the times I yawn in the notes videos? So there are 4 things that you could write about here that I considered. And of course, if you think of something that I don't mention here, but you think it counts as a moment of, political upheaval that affects the presidency, write about it. But the 4 I thought of were Carter's pardon of the draft dodgers, because we know that caused a lot of divisiveness with conservatives, really critical, and even moderates, not thinking that was cool, Jimmy Carter. 2, obviously the Iranian hostage crisis, which was when our embassy in Tehran was attacked, and we know our hostages were held for 444 days. And ultimately it hurt Jimmy Carter because he wasn't, and it hurt his party, which was one of the reasons why he wasn't able to get his next candidate elected when Reagan ran. 3rd would be the Camp David Accords, which was the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel to, try to end the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000-year-old beef between those 2 groups of people that really flopped and ended up in the death of the Egyptian president. That would be one. And then the election of 1980 and the shift, even though that was technically not involving Jimmy Carter because he wasn't running, it definitely, Jimmy Carter's presidency affected that election of 1980, how people felt about him, how people felt about the Democratic Party, about people how felt about liberals, which opened up the opportunity for that new sort of like big wave of conservatism, that Reagan revolution to like come into play. So that would definitely be a big one that you could write about. And then the three that you could, or four that you could talk about for Reagan would be Reaganomics and his efforts at supply side economics. If the economics were, yeah, I'm sure that Corey had more people to add to his hit list this unit. But if you struggle with understanding economics and, you know, financial things, don't try to write about it. Don't try to write about Reaganomics if that was confusing. Leave it away. Choose something that you do know how to write about. But his, you know, tax cuts to the to the top, that trickle down economics, supply side economics, and how that eventually by the mid 80s pulled us out of our stagflation drama. And a lot of people liked Reagan for it, which helped him get reelected for a second term. Second for Reagan, I would say, is that rise in fundamentalism and the founding of the moral majority. You read that a piece of Listen America, that book from Jerry Falwell. I'm sure you had plenty of opinions, but you know, he's long gone, so you don't need to worry about Jerry Falwell. But definitely those types of thoughts and were very common and prevalent, and people like Jerry Falwell were very popular, and he had a lot of political sway, and he used it to support Reagan. So this, unlike, you know, some of these other things where we're talking about like the hostage crisis, which when we say its impact on the presidency, it was a negative one, right? It reflects really poorly on Carter. But when you're talking about Reagan and the fundamentalists, that ended up having a really positive impact on Reagan's presidency because it's going to help garner him a lot of support. So that's something that you would want to mention. The third would be the Iran-Contra Incident. Once again, that can kind of be confusing if you had trouble keeping straight. You know, you'll definitely need to know enough to be able to do the multiple choice, know who the Contras are, know who Hezbollah is, know how Israel was involved, know who Oliver North is. But if you don't feel like you can explain those things enough on your own, don't worry about Iran-Contra. You'll get it done in the multiple choice. Pick something else for the short answer. And then last would be the fall of the Soviet Union. Actions that Reagan took to bring about the fall of the Soviet Union, whether it be increasing in spending, establishing a new relationship with leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev, or aiding anti-communist governments abroad, like in Afghanistan or Grenada. So all of that stuff. And that would, again, be something that you would consider to be a positive impact on the Republican Party, which is going to allow them to get Reagan's vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, elected. And we'll talk about his presidency and everything. We'll get into Clinton, and I'm going to get you all the way up. We've got, you know, nothing but time now. We don't really necessarily have to do a lot of review since you're, you know, we haven't had anything official having been said at this point about state exams, but we're pretty sure that those aren't happening. But I'll give you some type of exam myself. It'll, you know, it won't be any easier or harder than the regular state exam, and it'll just be marked like complete or incomplete. But what was I saying? Oh, but we don't have to necessarily review as intensely for that as we would have for the state exam. So we've got extra time so we can get into more details about like current events. Hopefully some things that you're like, if you've got questions about, you know, current things going on, whether it be like the Flint water crisis or the coronavirus, I'll be able to get to all of them in Unit 7. So we'll talk about Bush and everything then. So those are all the things that you could potentially put down for this question. Like I said, you choose the three that work best for you. If that's Watergate, the hostage crisis, and Iran-Contra, knock those out. And also, if you don't feel like you have to pick like one from each president, you don't need a Nixon thing, a Carter thing, and a Reagan thing. If you want to do three things for Jimmy Carter because his presidency was a hot mess and you feel like you can have plenty you can say about him, then do that. Absolutely. You just have to have any three from this unit and be able to explain it. Make sure you follow through with the whole. Sometimes we have a difficult time like bringing it home. And what I mean when I say that is connecting back to the question. When I say be sure to explain their impact on the presidency, Tell me that. Don't leave that part out. That's an important piece. Last, I could definitely tell that being able to prepare and have your notes in front of you obviously helps. Last time people's short answer questions were very good. And for the most part, everybody did really, really well on the last test. I had a few people who clearly didn't prepare regardless of all of your resources and everything that you have at home. So if you're having trouble, please, like I said, reach out to me. Your test isn't until Monday, so you have all weekend. Okay, question number 2. The second question you're going to be writing says, as the Soviet Union began to experience decline in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, our government began turning its attention to other issues. Identify and explain 3 foreign policy events or issues during these decades. So what we're looking for this question is non-Cold War related foreign policy moments. So, and I want to make it specific here, and I'll make a note of it on your test. You cannot talk about the same thing in question 2 that you mentioned in question 1. So if you say the Iran hostage crisis as a moment of political upheaval for question 1, you cannot use it as your non-Cold War foreign policy moment in question 2. So make sure that you are not having any overlap there. So things that you could mention for this. Once again, you could talk about the Camp David Accords. Once again, you could talk about the Iranian hostage crisis. You could also talk about the war on drugs, right? We know that Nixon started the war on drugs. Reagan kept it rolling, Carter kept it rolling, but once we really get to the end of the Cold War, we start putting a lot more money and effort into this. That's when they arrest the dictator of Panama and they start targeting the Colombian drug cartel. That was all under Bush's presidency. So you could talk about the war on drugs, Operation Restore Hope, which was that peacekeeping mission that we did in Somalia during their civil war. You could talk about that. The student protests in China, in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square. But if you talk about that, of course, you'd want to give me background and talk about how they were pro-democracy protests and how the Chinese government rolled in tanks and massacred all of these people. Don't leave out the U.S. of it all, right? Don't leave us out. This is an American history question after all. Make sure that you explain that in response to the Tiananmen Square incident, President Bush cut off all arms deals and weapon sales to China and said, we're not going to be selling you weapons if you're just going to use them to kill civilians. And then you can also mention we didn't cut off China in other forms of trade. We kept a diplomatic and trade relationship with them. We just stopped selling them military weapons. You could also talk about the South African apartheid, anti-apartheid movement, and Nelson Mandela. Same as the Tiananmen Square incident. You'll want to give me background, tell me what apartheid is, tell me who Nelson Mandela is, and then get me to the America of it all. Tell me how we were involved and about how American companies stopped doing business with South Africa, which hurt their economy, to put pressure on their government to repeal their apartheid laws, and how Bush formally endorsed Nelson Mandela for president and supported him once he was elected. And then the last thing that you could throw in here would be the Persian Gulf War. That's obviously a really big one. One of our really, the past military conflicts that we've been in since World War II, whether it be Korea, Vietnam, or other small peacekeeping missions, have pretty much all been to prevent the spread of communism. That was not this. This was an entirely new situation and a very much a non-Cold War moment for us. And our first real moment of, troops on the ground in the Middle East, which we know now in 2020 is primarily where our troops are on the ground. So that's a big moment. So make sure you can explain who we're at war with, why we're at war with them, what the outcome of the war is, and how that, looks on Bush. People really feel, his approval ratings go up. People feel great about Bush after the Persian Gulf War as our sort of first soiree into conflict in the Middle East. But we know it won't be the last, and it obviously will probably kind of be a high moment in terms of all of our conflict in the Middle East. It's sort of all downhill from the Persian Gulf War. So that's all I've got for that question. But of course, if you think there's something in the notes or something that you want to write about in there that is non-Cold War foreign policy during this unit, you can absolutely do it I know the safe bet is to just do what I'm suggesting, but feel free to write about something else if you can think of it. I'm going to give you a minute to type any questions into the chat box before I move on to the matching. I start rattling off all of these people in case you have any questions about those. But remember, you are going to have to answer both of those questions. You're going to have to choose 3 for each. And I'll repeat again, they cannot repeat. You cannot say Camp David Accords was a moment of political upheaval and reflected badly on Jimmy Carter. And then you cannot also re-explain the Camp David Accords as a moment of non-Cold War foreign policy. So make sure you are not getting any overlap. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to move on to the matching. So I'm just going to go in order, and I'll just give you. I'm not looking at the test. I don't have the test in front of me, so I don't know the exact wording and description that's going to be on there. But I will, give you a brief overview, and you can always go back and rewind this later, and then you can always just, Google all of these people. Barry Goldwater was a hardcore conservative. He ran against Johnson back in the 60s, but he was sort of the face of that early wave of conservatism before Reagan took over. And he was the one who was so critical of Jimmy Carter when he pardoned those draft dodgers. Are you going to send out a study guide? The study guide is posted on, I think it says review sheet, but it's the study guide. That is posted on Canvas already. I posted that a couple of days ago. So if you don't see it or anything, let me know and I'll double check on that, but it should be up there. Bob Woodward of Woodward and Bernstein, and we could do Carl Bernstein, who's also on the list. So they were reporters for the Washington Post who contacted, or I guess I should say were contacted by the anonymous source Deep Throat, who ended up being that FBI agent who had all that info on how the Watergate scandal and cover up went all the way up the ladder to Nixon. There's a pretty good drunk history on Woodward and Bernstein, and the Deep Throat source. But I can't remember what episode it is, but I'm sure you could just Google like drunk history Watergate if you have a Hulu account and you want to watch a drunk history to do some review over the weekend. But both of them, if I even though they're both on here, obviously I wouldn't give you a description of like journalists of the Washington Post whose source was Deep Throat. I wouldn't put both of them as an option. I would only put one. Just make sure that you know that both of them do fit that description so that you can pick out either name. Boris Yeltsin was the leader of Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, the new leader of the Russian Federation. Colin Powell is our military general leading Operation Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf War, and he will later on be George W. Bush, baby Bush, his Secretary of Defense. But that won't be on the test since we haven't gotten there yet. Just the Persian Gulf War aspect will be. Gerald Ford, one and only non-elected president that we've ever had, right? Because he wasn't elected president or vice president, and he was only president for 2 years, president after Nixon. James McCord was the ex-CIA guy who worked for the Nixon campaign, who broke into the Watergate complex and turned basically like state's witness in exchange for a lighter sentence. Jerry Falwell, he's the one whose Lists in America excerpt you read. He was the televangelist and the founder of the Moral Majority. He was also the president of Liberty University for quite a while, and his son is now the president of Liberty University. If you've ever considered Liberty as a school, that's Jerry Falwell's school. Jimmy Carter, we should definitely know, right? President for 2 terms, and what a man, right? Peanut farmer from Georgia turned one of the most controversial presidents we've ever had. Manuel Noriega, he was the, oh man, I lost my list. I just scrolled too quickly. He was the, what's the word I'm looking for? The dictator of Panama, who was using government funds to fund the Colombian drug cartel. And he was brought down, arrested, put in jail in the United States. So that was a war on drugs thing. Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union around the mid to late 80s, who worked so well with President Reagan with his new policies of glasnost and perestroika and other things. And he was one of the reasons why the Cold War ultimately came to an end when it did. Nelson Mandela, the president of South Africa and the leader of the Anti-Apartheid movement. Paul Volcker was the new head of the Federal Reserve appointed by Jimmy Carter, who hiked up those interest rates in order to try to stabilize the economy during stagflation, which worked for a brief period of time. But then unfortunately, the Fed left those interest rates in place too long, which led to the reemergence. It's okay if you can't keep watching, Corey, just, come back and finish the video later so you can get all the info you need. But what did I just say? Oh, it caused for another economic sort of recession there right at the beginning of starting in 1980. But with the supply side and trickle down economics by the mid 80s, we're out of it. Richard Nixon, obviously president, one and only president ever to resign. He was not the second president impeached. Clinton will be the second president impeached. Like I said, we'll get to that in Unit 7. Ronald Reagan, president 40th, I think, if my math is right, somewhere around, I think he's 40th president of the United States. Before that, governor of California, actor, Reaganomics, end of the Cold War, all that jazz, Iran-Contra. Saddam Hussein, dictator of Iraq during the Persian Gulf War and later the Iraq War. Sandra Day O'Connor, First Lady, appointed to the Supreme Court, appointed by President Ronald Reagan. And Spiro Agnew, what a name that is. He was the vice president for Nixon originally, and then Spiro Agnew had to resign during the Watergate scandal, not because of Watergate. Corey, that was not long. He had to resign because he was caught taking bribes while he was governor of Maryland, or a congressman from Maryland or something, but I think it was governor. So he resigned during a scandal, but not because of the scandal. He resigned because of a different scandal. So that those are your matching. So like I said, if you've got questions about the study guide, if you're having trouble seeing it, or if you're studying this weekend and, if you write out your answer to a short, one of those short answer questions, you want to take a picture and send it to me and let me know if I think that would be good or if you should add more or anything like that. I'm happy to do that. I have quite a few people that normally do that, so feel free. But like I said, don't wait on it, because if you wait till Monday to ask me, then I'm going to be too busy and I won't be able to. So if you need me to help you with something like that, make sure you do it Saturday or Sunday. And if you have questions about your project, make sure you ask them to me, preferably before 5 o'clock today. Because that's probably when I'll be able to give you the most amount of attention. And don't forget that your projects are due tonight. I hope that you are all staying safe and staying indoors. Wash your hands, use hand sanitizer, wear a mask when you go outside. Don't know when I'll see you again, but you'll be seeing me the next time we do a review for Unit 7, which will be starting on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.